friends. I am Suzanne Gase with Pathfinders for Peace, and we are so excited to host Professor Damian Kingsbury, who is a renowned expert on independence movements and lots of things related to that, how governments interact with them, what the outcomes are. And so it's very relevant to those interested in the movement for an independent Ambazonia, or whatever you choose to call it, the former British Southern Cameroons, northwest and southwest of Cameroon. A few ground rules before we get started. Please do remain on mute unless you're called on to ask a question. Please be respectful. I do have the power to mute you if absolutely necessary, but I use that only sparingly. Once we get into the question and answer, questions are welcome and comments are welcome too. This can be a dialogue, but please keep the comments brief, not speeches. So I may intervene to ask you to sort of wrap up your comment if it starts to go on too long. When you are asking a question or making a comment, I hope that you will share your face with us on video, but if it's a situation where you feel your security requires that you stay anonymous and off camera, we respect that. If you need to, in fact, feel free to use the Zoom function where you can actually change your name to a pseudonym if you are more comfortable with that. This meeting is being recorded, and that is particularly because of time zone challenges. Professor Kingsbury is in Melbourne, Australia, and it was hard to find a time that would work for him and for us and for people in different parts of the US and Europe and Africa. So I'm afraid the time is pretty difficult for those on the other side of the Atlantic. So I am sorry about that, but we've done our best with the many different time zones, and those who can't make it will be able to view this recording later. So a final reminder that all of our guest speakers represent only their individual views and not necessarily the views of Pathfinders for Peace. So at this point, I'm going to put myself on mute and turn it over to Professor Kingsbury to share some thoughts with you for about half an hour or so. And after that, we'll open it up for questions and discussion. So over to you, Damian.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you very much to Pathfinders for Peace for the opportunity to speak to you today. Before we start, I should probably, as a start, I should probably clarify some terminology. I've worked with a number of organisations in different places, and there's a great deal of sensitivity about terminology. Perfectly understandable that the sensitivity has to do with legitimacy and non-legitimacy. So what we might call commonly separatist or secessionist movements prefer generally to be referred to as independence or liberation movements. And that's a perfectly reasonable way of approaching the subject. The only complication is that when you talk about independence or liberation movements in a broad sense, it starts to confuse them with countries which are seeking to break colonial bonds, if you like, the first generation of independence or liberation movements. When we talk about secessionism or separatism, we need to keep in mind the origin of the word comes from the Latin root set, which means him or itself, which simply implies that this is of itself, that it is self-rule, and that it doesn't have a pejorative quality to it. So if I mention the term secessionist or separatist, it's not in a pejorative sense. It doesn't diminish the legitimacy or otherwise of the claims that might be made. The talk will be in two parts. The first part will look at, very briefly, separatist or liberation organisations, what the usual criteria are for their successful organisation. And the second part will look at conflict resolution. When we start talking about movements of this type, sub-state liberation movements, if you like. In the post-1945 era, there have been approximately 150 such movements, depending on how you choose to count. What's important, though, is to note that just 5 have been successful, and that does not give a very good strike rate, if you like, for the successful outcome of the claims made by particular groups. The successful candidates in this case are Bangladesh, Eritrea, East Timor, Kosovo, and South Sudan. And they each had specific factors which influenced their outcomes, which we'll touch on a bit later on. In terms of what is required for a group to successfully launch a bid for liberation of a people or an area, there's a number of criteria. The first is that there needs to be a politically bonded group identifying itself in common. That is, a people doesn't need to be absolutely unified, 100% unified around a particular issue or a particular identity. But it helps if most people in a given area feel that they are bonded to the people in the area. And this is usually through language or other key cultural markers, perhaps religion, and so on. But language is usually the common one. And of course, in the case study that you're most concerned with, of course, language is the key unifying factor. The next fairly critical point is that the group in question needs to occupy a largely contiguous territory. And the reason why I say this is because if a territory is not contiguous, it can, over time, set up competing interests. Even if the group identifies itself in common, there can be issues which are related to territorial difference and which can actually divide the movement or the group of people and thus weaken its claim. A perfect example of this at the moment is Palestine, which is divided between the West Bank and Gaza, and that has resulted in effect, 2 political groups operating in both territories, and that has allowed, let's just say, it's allowed for them to be weakened because of their lack of unity and for consequent actions to be taken. Of course, there's no point in seeking independence or liberation unless there is a clear reason, and it's usually based around a fairly compelling grievance. Now, the grievance can be anything from economic exclusion, persecution, and so on, but a grievance which is commonly shared is essential to the movement having the possibility of a successful outcome. And indeed, in the cases which I've cited, the 5 examples, the grievances were substantial. Groups which don't have other unifying features such as language, can cohere in the face of grievance. That is, a grievance can be sufficiently strong, at least in the short term, to bring a group together. If people identify a grievance in common, that can actually be a unifying feature. The problem is it's difficult to sustain, because at different points the grievance might be addressed through either parts of the group or the group overall. And once the grievance is addressed, then the unifying factor tends to diminish, and of course that's problematic. In the literature, there's also the claim that greed can motivate such movements, that individuals can benefit and would sustain or continue to keep a movement going for reasons of personal or group greed. Now, whilst I understand that can be the case in some instances, it's not a sustainable basis for a successful prosecution of a conflict. That is, that if greed is the only factor, then ultimately people who are fighting for a particular cause will ultimately say, what is the point in having material gain if we die, or if we risk dying, or if our loved ones die? So ultimately greed is not sustainable. It may be a short-term motivation, and it may be a mechanism by which such movements are sustained economically, but it's not a long-term a sustainable basis for a successful prosecution of conflict. The final point, and this is critical, when we look at these types of movements, we need to understand, did they occur in a state that was unified or seen to be unified at the point of independence, or did it occur in a state which has subsequently come together? And in this, I go to the Latin principle of uti possidetis, ita possidetis, meaning as you possess, so you may continue to possess. This is the basic principle of international law, which provides for newly formed sovereign states to retain the borders they had as colonies. Now, if a territory has a territorial border or boundary which predates the independence of a particular state, under this principle of uti possidetis, it has a very much stronger claim to independence. And in this, I would cite the example of East Timor. East Timor was a Portuguese colony. It wasn't a Dutch colony. Indonesia. When Indonesia invaded East Timor, Portuguese Timor in 1975, it had a separate colonial history. So uti possidetis meant that it was never recognised by the United Nations as being part of Indonesia, even though Indonesia occupied the territory for 24 years. This provides, I think, a fundamental difference in terms of, if we look at the example of Western Sahara, you have a separate colony, what was Spanish Sahara, being ruled independently of Morocco. Now, when Morocco invaded in 1975, it was occupying a territory which identified itself in common and which, under this principle of international law, should have been recognised as an independent state. However, the Spanish government said, this is all too difficult, we're going to hand this over to Morocco, they can have it, we're going to wash our hands of it. Unfortunately, the Sahrawi people of Western Sahara didn't agree, and there has been a conflict in that region ever since. It's fair to say that Western Sahara's chances of obtaining independence are not great, even though the United Nations has been involved since the early 1990s. But that matter is still, if you like, in abeyance. So under the principle of uti possidetis, Western Sahara should be granted independence, or at least be given the opportunity of a referendum on its future. Unfortunately, Morocco has military sway in that territory and has refused to allow to proceed. So they're the basics of what constitutes, if you like, successful liberation movements. You need these criteria. I should also mention too Somaliland. Somalia was an Italian colony. Somaliland itself was a British colony. It had a different political history. And I think if we're looking at, say, Amazonia, there's some commonality there. That the political model used by British colonial forces was different to that in the rest of the territory. And it set up a different political dynamic subsequently. So Somaliland is functionally independent, although not independent in international law. It's not recognised as being independent, but it functions as an independent state. I was there a couple of years ago, and you have a fully functioning country, its own economy, its own currency, banking system, and so on. Okay, so there are a number of elements to these types of conflicts, which I probably won't go into, but it's worth noting that the capacity of the respective parties to wage conflict, the material resources they have available to them, whether they have support, international or external support, and of course their economic foundations all play into the success or otherwise of such movements. Movements which have international support tend to be more successful. movements which lack international support tend to be less successful. And of course, again, cite the example of Kosovo and East Timor, both of which had significant international intervention, and that was the guarantee of their success. You also need to keep in mind too that some conflicts are proxy conflicts, that they are actually being promoted by external parties for reasons other than the liberation, independence of a particular people. That might be an outcome of the conflict, but that is not necessarily the primary reason for external support. So we need to keep in mind that if there is external assistance, it may be for reasons which are distinct from that of itself. When we talk about, we'll move on to the second part, when we talk about resolution typologies, there's a number. Absolute military victory, as in South Sudan and Eritrea. The movements in both those territories were militarily successful in absolute terms, that the prior government was not able to sustain conflict in those territories and acceded the claims of the territories to independence. So that they were pretty clear. There can also be, on the other hand, absolute military defeat, for example, in Sri Lanka. And I spent time with the Tamil Tigers there just prior to the last phase of that conflict. Absolute military defeat. The Tamil Tigers had the opportunity to find a resolution to their conflict, which would have ended up in some sort of federal arrangement, but wanted to claim more territory, in particular the port of Trincomalee, before they were prepared to enter into negotiations. The problem was that they left their run too late. The Sri Lankan army and government remilitarised, and when it launched its final assault, the Tamil Tigers were simply not strong enough to resist, and they were literally wiped out. I think everybody I knew in northern Sri Lanka was killed. An absolute disaster for that particular movement. And as I mentioned, external intervention. Timor-Leste, Kosovo, Bangladesh, of course, India, into that particular conflict, which Bangladesh became independent from Pakistan, and that was the deciding factor again. There can be formally negotiated peace agreements. They usually require compromise, and of course, independence movements, liberation movements are reluctant to compromise because it means that they have to give out some of their claims. However, in many cases, the choices are a compromised resolution or a conflict which goes on effectively, or indeed risks absolute military defeat, as in the case of Sri Lanka. So sometimes mediated conflict outcomes can provide a satisfactory outcome. And in that, to illustrate that, I'll give the examples of Mindanao in the Philippines. The Moro Islamic Liberation Front has agreed to effectively self-government in the Moro territories, the Moro homeland. And in Aceh in Indonesia, the conflict had quite a deal of involvement in. They settled for what was referred to as Pemerintah Sendiri, which is Indonesian for self-government, and that satisfied the claims of Free Aceh. Indeed, what they did is they looked back to the 1950s and said that an earlier rebellion was actually intended to achieve that sort of self-governing arrangement. Now, the Indonesian government has subsequently moved to undermine elements of that peace agreement, but by and large it's held. We signed the peace agreement in 2005. That's almost 2 decades. So on the scale of conflict resolution process, that is generally as successful. In Myanmar, for example, the Kachin Independence Organisation doesn't actually want to separate from the country. What it wants is a return to an earlier version of a constitution, which under Article 10 allowed for a federal model in which you had separate states which were self-governing but coming together for the purpose of larger exercises such as external defence, communications, currency, and so on. There's transitionalism, which you have in Bougainville, which, if you're not familiar, is an island to the east of Papua New Guinea. That island is currently in the process of transitioning from being part of Papua New Guinea to having a referendum on independence, which is very likely to produce an independent outcome. You have power sharing in Northern Ireland, and that has been quite bad. And as I say, then there's autonomy or self-government within traditional territories such as Mindanao and Aceh. Critical requirements for successful negotiation are, in the first instance, preparedness of both parties to be at the table. Generally speaking, that would be a consequence of a hurting stalemate where neither side can win, but both feel that they are losing, that the cost of continuing conflict is greater than than a compromise. There are generally no preconditions when you go into negotiation. The idea that there should be preconditions tends to derail negotiation processes. The conditions of a conflict resolution process tend to be, if it's going to be successful, tend to be discussed once the talks have started, and indeed it's part of the process. A truce is useful, but not necessary. You can actually conduct talks while the war is raging, again, as we did in the case of Aceh. The ripeness of the moment is a good time for these talks to take place. Is there a confluence of international and internal conditions, which mean that the trajectory is towards resolution as opposed to the continuation of conflict? Unity, and I can't stress this enough, there must be unity on the part of the parties going to a negotiated process. If an organisation or a movement is not united, it will fail at the first hurdle, because there will be parts of it which will act against the interests of those who are negotiating, and it will completely undermine the process. So unity is absolutely essential. In this instance, to illustrate this, there are a number of groups in northeast India, in Nagaland, that had divided, for want of a better term, tribal lines. A number of years ago, I went to spend some time with them, and over a period of time, we got to a point where the groups could come together, disagreeing over many issues, but agreeing as to the central purpose of their united claim. And that was incredibly important in their own struggle. It won't necessarily produce the outcome they want, but it will certainly get a very significant step closer to it. The neutralisation of spoilers, that is, people within organisations who, for their own personal or political reasons, want to derail a process, spoilers must be neutralised, and they can be on both sides. Indeed, in Northern Ireland, there were spoilers, and I know that the British military actually neutralised some of the spoilers on the other side of that negotiation process. They targeted for assassination. But that works both ways. The Crouch movement did much the same thing. It identified people on the other side who were spoilers, and one of those was neutralised. And indeed, the Indonesian government withdrew people from the negotiation process because they were trying to spoil the process as it was being conducted. So the neutralisation of spoilers is critical. The quality and capacity and unity of negotiating teams is a given. You need the best possible team with the best possible information, the greatest capacity. And you need a mediator who you trust and who has capacity to actually manage a negotiation process. I'll finish up in a minute. When we talk about negotiation processes, we need to acknowledge grievances, respective grievances on both sides. But there are going to be claims on both sides of any conflict. And there needs to be some acknowledgement of the respective claims by both parties. That is the first step towards resolving conflict to produce satisfactory to both parties. that may require rethinking goals, which is often anathema to independence and liberation movements. But sometimes, and this is a pretty important thing to think about, when we think about independence and liberation movements, we need to think not what are they trying to achieve, but what is the purpose of independence or liberation? Is it to produce a better standard of living for people? Is it to stop human rights abuses? Is it to create dignity, if you like? Whatever it is, ask yourself the question, is it possible to achieve those goals in a different way? Is independence the only way to achieve those goals? If you can achieve the goals that independence was supposed to achieve without formally having independence, then is it worth thinking about alternative approaches which might produce those goals, achieve those goals, but not necessarily with what is often the sticking point of independence or liberation. Now, again, I know that's difficult, but sometimes about the purpose of independence movements. If you can satisfy the grievances, resolve the grievances, then the rationale for independence starts to look less significant or less compelling. Finally, the roles of third parties, soft and hard interventions, external pressure and inducements, and in guarantees can all have a place in pushing parties towards a conclusion which might be successful. The guarantees in particular are pretty important because often what independence movements will say is as they move towards some sort of resolution, that they feel vulnerable, that if they step back from conflict, that they will open themselves up to attack. And that's a perfectly reasonable concern. So having external guarantees is actually often a way of helping calm the concerns of movements towards achieving resolution of conflict. I'll leave it there. I think that's just on a half an hour, and happy to take questions or engage in a discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. Wow, lots of meat there in a short period of time. I just want to recap a few points, make sure I heard them correctly, make sure others take note. You said, if I heard correctly, and the sound is just a little bit fuzzy at times, did you say there have been 157 independence movements in the post-World
War II?
Post-World War
II.
II.
Post-1945, yeah. It's approximately 100. Depends on how you choose to count them, but up to 200, maybe 120, 130, but around 100 movements which have been armed.
Oh, that's armed independence movements.
Yeah.
Okay. And of those, just 5 have been successful. And I caught Bangladesh, Eritrea, East Timor, South Sudan. Did you count Kosovo? Kosovo. Which, and actually even Kosovo, I think, is not 100% recognized as an independent state. Yeah.
No,
so 4.5. So
yeah.
Got independence.
I think for functional purposes, Kosovo should be included.
Okay.
It is functionally independent. Problematic, I agree, but it does tick the boxes, I think.
So the big requirements for success in actually creating a new state are a politically bonded group that has some identity in common, although a common grievance may sometimes be enough, but that's more iffy. They need to occupy a largely contiguous territory. There needs to be some motivation, usually grievances. And this last point was quite fascinating of uti possidetis. I don't speak Latin. Uti, yeah. But was there, if I understand that point correctly, and maybe you can clarify, it has to do with whether there was some separate history from the rest of the state. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Great. Okay.
So in the case, again, of East Timor, it was a Portuguese colony. It wasn't part of the independent Indonesian state, which was the successor state to the Dutch East Indies Empire. Somaliland was separate to Italian Somalia, and so on. So where you have territories which have a separate colonial, under the principle of urti possidetis, a claim is for the colonial territory and the boundaries which are associated. So in the case of Amazonia, that was under British administration, it has a claim under the principle. And that is actually a strengthening claim in terms of international law.
So I would imagine, though, that those 4 criteria are not, they are necessary, but maybe not sufficient, right? Because that still can't account for the 95+% of, there must be some of the
military capacity is pretty significant.
Right. Okay.
In the case of South Sudan and Eritrea, both of those groups had greater capacity than the Central.
And you also spoke of international support,
or international intervention.
Or intervention. Yeah. And then talking about how these conflicts end, you mentioned absolute victory, absolute defeat, external intervention, and negotiated peace agreements. And when it comes to negotiations, you talked about the preparedness of both parties, the unity within each party, because the groups can end up at cross purposes with themselves, essentially, with other elements of their own movement. And you would encourage groups to think about what would independence actually achieve for them, and are there other arrangements that might fulfill those goals?
Right.
Okay. I'm tempted to keep asking you questions, but I want to open the floor. So please use the Zoom hand raise button if you'd like to ask a question or make a brief comment, and just remember, please be respectful of everyone. Well, while people are thinking of their questions, I will ask one more. So you talked about the preparedness of both parties. Can you, for successful negotiations, can you say a little bit more about what preparedness entails?
Preparedness is, if you like, a broadly inclusive proposition. So preparedness means that you want to be in the negotiation process. So you actually think that the time is right for that you have a team that you can take to that. The team is representative of the conflict. So usually in these conflicts, you have a military wing and a political wing. The political wing is usually that negotiation. Although sometimes the differentiation is not great. Touch and Independence Organisation, stroke Army, good example. Tamil Tigers, political wing and the military wing are essentially the same. But you need a capacity to go to the process, that you need a team of people who actually know what they're doing, are prepared, have some ideas about what they want to achieve out of the process, and have the authority to conduct negotiations on behalf of the group. There's no point going into a negotiation process, say, as a political group, if the military wing doesn't support it. That's pretty basic. So thinking through the goals that you wish to achieve, those which you are prepared to sacrifice. Sometimes there are things that are less important, which are part of the initial claim that you put to the side by way of easing the negotiation process. Of course, removing spoilers critical process. So being prepared encapsulates all of these things. Removing spoilers having a unified team, knowing with the authority to speak and knowing what it is that they achieve, and having the capacity to prosecute those claims.
Okay, thank you. We have a hand up by Dennis. Is it Lehman? Or Lyman?
Yes. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Thank you very much for giving me the chance. My name is Dennis Lehman. I'm originally from the former Republic of Southern Cameroon. It's in the Gulf of Guinea. The main country is called Cameroon. We have a conflict running since 2017, thousands of deaths, and we actually checked all the boxes you've indicated. We were a sovereign country. We got our independence. We got into an agreement, and the agreement was disrupted or was cancelled in 1972. There is a war going on. What is the best option for our people to get to a peaceful settlement with the Republic of Cameroon? Because we don't have the military might to defeat them militarily. But there's a conflict and it's not giving way anytime soon. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Dennis. That's a really good question. I think you've touched on the critical issue here, is that independence or liberation movements usually don't have the military capacity to achieve a military victory, an absolute military victory, or to compel another government to accede to their demand. And that's why most such movements are not successful. They don't have the person power, they don't have the military equipment, they often don't have the organisation. So if you look at the conflict in the territory you're referring to, what's claimed to be Amazonia, that is a largely defensive conflict. That is, it doesn't extend beyond the territory which is claimed. So in a sense, the government in Cameroon has very little reason to want to resolve or to accede, because ultimately it doesn't affect Cameroon proper. And this is where I need to be very careful. I mentioned to Suzanne, there are some things I can say publicly and there are some things I can't say publicly. But there is if you like, a principle that if the conflict is brought home to the government which is opposing independence, and that they start to recognise that they are paying a cost at home and not just somewhere else, then they will be more likely to consider a different arrangement, let's put it that way, be it independence or some sort of action. How that occurs is moot. I think in the case of South Sudan, it's clear that once there was a slight rearrangement of political and military forces, that the government of Sudan simply didn't have the military capacity. In Eritrea, the Eritreans were actually probably the militarily most important part of the movement to change the government. And part of the agreement that they had is, if we manage to succeed in changing the government, the price we will demand for that is independence. Again, that was acceded to simply because they had the military capacity to compel that. In international law, Amazonia has a strong case for independence. It does meet all of the criteria. It is not united. The movement is not united. And the way I see it is that's the single biggest weakness at the moment. There needs to be unity, absolutely. So there is two parts to the process there. The first is to achieve unity between the respective groups. That's going to be very, very difficult. Possible, but difficult. And the second is, once the unity, then there can be a proper discussion about entering into some sort of alternative arrangement with Cameroon, be it independence or whatever. I'll give you an example. In West Papua, in Indonesia, there's been a movement for independence there since about 1960. not successful. It's probably not going to be. It is internally divided. And the Indonesian government says, we would like to talk to the independence movement about some sort of alternative arrangement, but we don't know who to talk to because there's competing voices. Unity, again, I can't stress enough, unity is absolutely as the first criteria for success. Without unity, you can't have it. Unity is the first thing. That's what's lacking in Amazonia. And that if I was to be involved in that process, that would be my first task, would be to work on constructing this unity. That answer your question?
Let me intervene for just a moment, just to follow up on one point that you made. You said that kind of bringing the fight to where the government is, the government opposing independence is one way that independence movements get closer to their goals. I wonder if there are peaceful alternatives that accomplish the same thing. I mean, it seems that what you're talking about is really raising the awareness, where it's easy to be in the capital of Cameroon or in the capital of, the Philippines while the Moro conflict was going on, and so on and so on, and really just sort of ignore it, right? So in effect, isn't what you're arguing for awareness raising, and could that be done through education and maybe also through international pressure?
Yeah, look, it can be done through a number of means, but it needs to be compelling. And for awareness to be compelling, there has to be a factor involved which brings it home in absolute terms. And that's where there's probably more carrot than stick. Sorry, more stick than carrot, if I can use the term. That is, and I've got to be careful here because I'm not advocating for violence. I'm not advocating for acts of terrorism, so-called. But it is when the conflict is brought home that politicians in the home territory start to pay attention. In the case of Northern Ireland, when the conflict was taken to the UK mainland, English mainland, politicians in the United Kingdom started paying pretty serious attention. Now, again, I can't advocate that. I can't say that I think this is a good thing, but it certainly got their attention, and it actually kick-started the background that resulted in the Good Friday. But yeah, look, but if it can be as a consequence of international intervention, the problem with international intervention is the intervening parties externally need to have their own compelling reasons to involve, and that's often not present. And, whether it's a material interest, an economic interest, a geostrategic interest, whatever it is, there needs to be a compelling reason for external parties to want to be involved. The era of responsibility to protect or humanitarian intervention came and went around the year 2000, give or take a couple of years either side. So that brief moment where the international community felt it had an international obligation to resolve conflicts by intervening on humanitarian grounds has essentially come and gone. The world has changed since that moment, and we're back in the situation where there's a superpower rivalry, and intervention is now seen through the prism of strategic interest.
All right. As someone who is passionate about prevention of armed conflict, among other things, I get frustrated that that the world doesn't pay so much attention when conflicts are in a non-violent stage. Yeah. Okay, Festus Shing, thank you so much for your patience. You're on.
Thank you for the opportunity, and It's great to talk about these things that affect humanity world over. I am a citizen of the world, and I hail from Southern Cameroon. And at the moment, I am based in London, in the UK. I would want to do two things. First, I would comment on the aspect of unity that you've stressed about, which is supposedly the first condition to fulfill before and a listening ear will be given or granted. In the modern age and time where there's a lot of fake and social medias all around and things are happening, that process is already in the case of Cameroon, greatly undermined by the Cameroon government with external support, forming groups that seem to be loyal to the Ambazonian crisis, and then disrupting the ability to have a united front to achieve the goals that we are looking for. That's just a comment in terms of unity, that it is undermined by the Cameroon government and the international system, because the Cameroon still has the support of the international system to sustain. Then my second point now will go to the International Court of Justice verdict on a case pitting Nigeria, Cameroon, that was announced in 2002 over a piece of land called Bakassi Peninsula. Cameroon filed in 1994 that Nigeria was claiming sovereignty over the piece of land. I am particularly interested in the verdict because the verdict said, Nigeria, withdraw your military and police over the territory because it was not part of your territory upon independence. The same verdict told Cameroon to withdraw its military and police from that piece of land because it wasn't incorporated into the map when they achieved independence. And without getting around the bush, that is a Southern Cameroon territory. So I seem not to understand how there is still no pathway for the international system to say, yes, for real, Southern Cameroons and the Republic of Cameroon came together. Southern Cameroon has been marginalized all through, up to the point where the president had to say in public that their mission was to assimilate Southern Cameroons into the majority Cameroon. And that is where the grievance escalated to arms, because they were using arms to suppress us trying to speak. So I am wondering, what would it take for the international system to come into play to say that for real, Ambazonians are not trying to secede, or we are not a terrorist group. We are not Cameroon. We never had independence. Southern Cameroons never had independence. So if my points were clear, then I think.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Festus.
Thank you, Festus. Yeah, look, the point you've just made is precisely that which I also made in relation to Posiditas. That is, the territory as you possess, so you shall possess. Now, that's a compelling argument in international law. The problem with international law is when we talk about it, it sounds like the law in a country that can be enforced. Unfortunately, international law is only as strong as the international community is prepared to impose it. So the findings, for example, of the International Court of Justice have moral value, moral weight, but don't necessarily have weight of compulsion. They don't have necessarily capacity. What you need to compulsion is for the international community to act on its decision. And that would usually through the United Nations Security Council. The United Nations Security Council itself needs to have two things. It needs to regard the situation as sufficiently compelling in the first instance, and in the second instance, it also needs. Now,
it also needs, sorry, say that again.
it needs to be united. The P5, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council need. If one of them disagrees with the process, then they have the power of veto. Now, if we go to the case of East Timor in 1999, it was a rare moment of international unity around the idea of humanitarian intervention. And the P5, the permanent 5 of the Security Council, agreed that there should be external intervention to resolve the crisis in East Timor. And that ultimately produced an independent country. Since then, certainly since the early 2000s, the international community has been much more divided. As you'd be aware, that there is significant international competition amongst the great powers, and there is no unity in P5 of the Security Council. So having agreement to intervene in southern Cameroon or Amazonia, or whatever you choose to call it, is unlikely, simply because the interests of the parties, of the key parties which should be united to achieve that purpose, aren't the same. I mean, France perhaps has its own interest. I know France has its own interest in relation to Morocco. So regardless of effort taken on that to achieve a settlement.
Damien, sorry, we're losing your sound a little bit. I think maybe if you could just lean in a bit to this. France perhaps has its own interests, and I lost you after that. Yeah,
France has its own interests in northwestern Africa. It supports Morocco for economic activities. So it essentially has undermined the claim of Polisario to independence. I don't know what its position is on Cameroon, but my guess is probably has interest there as well and would not be conducive to agreeing to an external intervention, the United Nations intervention. China and Russia would almost disagree on principle, simply because they are so antagonistic towards the United States at the moment. But getting agreement, unity of agreement, is almost impossible. And of course, it was the United Kingdom that actually took Southern Cameroon's independence off the table, off the referendum in the first instance. So when Southern Cameroon was incorporated into Cameroon proper, it was a consequence of the United Kingdom having deleted the option of it becoming an independent state. Whether the United Kingdom would change its mind is a moot point. Whether it would change its mind in a way that have it support intervention is a significant step. So one of the things you note, I've noted around the world, is that where there are crises of time, people in these places say, we are seeking justice, we are seeking to have our human rights respected, we are seeking to stop oppression. All of these things are perfectly reasonable. Why won't the international community say? The international community doesn't care sufficiently. And that's where it comes back to these types of movements, largely having to rely on their own reasons, their own bargaining power, creating bargaining power, and thinking creatively about ways towards resolving the conflict which achieve the goals that spurred them into action in the first place.
Good evening. I'm unable to raise my hand. I'm a bit late.
That's okay. Sir, you've got we've got 5 minutes left in the event, so please, a brief question or comment.
Okay, can I come on? Yeah, I know I came late, but I followed up with the speaker. Is it Festus? I was trying to find out about how we get the independent, what methods and ways to get to our country, Amazonia. I don't know if physical violence is okay. Physical violence was employed by the Republic, us, if we can also retaliate by physical violence, crossing their territory and doing like what Palestinians did. What if we do what Palestinians did to call the attention of the international community? Would it be a crime or what? A question.
I had a little bit of a hard time understanding you there, sir. Perhaps, is there anybody who can restate that I might hear better? But I think your point had to do with the violence used by the government of what folks here, Damien, call La République du Cameroun, the French Cameroon. Festus, quick restatement of that for us?
Yes, what he's actually trying to refer to is military intervention, to say when we demonstrate or when we speak up, we get attacked by the military. So is it okay if we retaliate? And then he's using the situation of Palestine, where they can now go over to Israel and have an attack, because it's never happened. We're only defending ourselves militarily at the moment. We've not had an attack in the Cameroon's territory.
So the question is essentially whether responding to government violence with violence,
if it would constitute a crime, if that happens.
Okay. In principle, there's states reserve for themselves legitimacy of the use of violence. That's a standard principle of countries around the world. And non-state actors, when they engage in violence, are generally regarded as illegitimate. The way I look at it and the way I've published about it in the past is there's 4 categories. There's legitimate state violence, that is legal process, military defence and so on. Illegitimate state violence, that is attacking people, particularly when they protest, case that's been mentioned now. Illegitimate non-state violence, that is non-state actors acting illegitimately, and most controversially, legitimate non-state violence. Now, again, I can't personally advocate that it's illegal, but I understand that with movements that people or believe that they are subject to illegitimate state violence, reacting to that is legitimate non-state violence. That is, they are defending themselves or they are prosecuting a claim to end illegitimate state violence in the case of Cameroon, of La République. What I said earlier is in relation to getting to a point of resolution, that being defensive is great because you look after your people, but it's not sufficient to compel a resolution. There needs to be something that compels the government of the state to want to engage in a process which will produce an outcome satisfactory to the aggrieved party, in this case, Ambazonia, South Cameroon. I can't advocate violence. I don't advocate violence. But I understand that increasing pressure on a government where it lives is one way of achieving that outcome. There are other methods of achieving that outcome. Again, I can't talk about it publicly because in my country it's illegal to do so. But these are methods that have in fact been usefully employed by a number of movements internationally to produce outcomes which don't necessarily produce independence, but which do produce outcomes which are satisfactory to the aggrieved party. I'll just very quickly touch on governments often do support fragmentary groups within independence movements to try to break up independence movements. That is hugely problematic, and in the number of cases I'm familiar with, had involvement with the main group has actually neutralised the breakaway or faux groups set up by the alternative government by way of achieving unity. The Tamil Tigers did that in North Sri Lanka. Free Aceh movement did that in Aceh and Malaysia, where they had their political base, and so on. So that's quite common, that there would be ginger groups, if you like, groups established to actually derail the unity of an opposing force. And that does need to be resolved if there is to be any chance of.
Okay, well, we have reached the end of our hour. I thank you all for your attention and your respectful questions. And I'm going to put here in the chat the link for Pathfinders for Peace. It's simply Pathfinders for the number 4 peace.org. And thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you at a future event. Professor Kingsbury, thank you ever so much. Please, yes.
If I can just say very quickly, I'm happy to continue the discussion offline. My email address is publicly available. If anybody wants to get in touch, I'm more than happy to. Okay.
Indeed. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation and patiently taking the questions and being open to further contact. So thank you so much, Professor Kingsbury.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
With that, I'll close this meeting.
Yeah, thank you so much.